The day I moved into my dream home, I thought I had finally escaped the noise, the chaos, and the constant stress of city life. But I was wrong. Within weeks, an unexpected letter showed up in my mailbox, not a welcome note, but a demand. The HOA wasn't just asking for compliance. They were threatening me with fines, intimidation, and even legal action over things so petty they barely made sense. But here's the part that still shocks me. What they didn't realize was that I had a plan of my own. So how far would they go, and how far would I have to fight back? When I first bought the house, I felt like I'd finally crossed a finish line. After years of renting tiny apartments and dealing with noisy neighbors stacked wall to wall, this place felt like a dream. A modest 2-story home with a wraparound porch tucked into what looked like a peaceful suburban neighborhood. The streets were lined with oak trees that arched overhead like a protective canopy, and kids rode their bikes in the cul-de-sacs without a care in the world. It looked perfect. For the first few weeks, life really did feel that way. I spent my mornings sipping coffee on the porch, waving at joggers passing by, and slowly fixing up the garden I'd always wanted. The neighbors smiled, introduced themselves casually, and everything seemed normal, safe, ordinary. But as I settled in, I started to notice little things that didn't quite fit the picture of calm suburbia. One neighbor seemed to always watch from their window whenever I parked my car. Another would comment politely but with a strange edge about how high my grass was growing, even though it was barely past my ankles. And then there was the community newsletter that arrived in my mailbox every Friday. At first glance, it looked harmless, filled with recipes, upcoming events, and cheerful reminders. But buried between the cheerful notes were bold warnings about violations, noncompliance, and mandatory corrections. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. After all, every neighborhood has rules, right? But it wasn't long before I realized these rules weren't suggestions. They were demands. And the people behind them weren't just neighbors trying to keep things orderly, they were part of something far more controlling, far more relentless. It started small, a slip of paper taped to my door about the color of my mailbox, then a notice about the length of my hedges. At first it was almost laughable, like someone had nothing better to do than nitpick. But beneath that surface of petty rules, I could feel something brewing, something that was about to turn my quiet dream home into the center of a storm. And the strangest part? Everyone in the neighborhood acted as if this was completely normal, like no one even questioned it. But I did. And the moment I started questioning it, everything began to change. At first, the notices felt like annoyances, the kind of thing you could laugh off and toss into a drawer. But within a month, they weren't just occasional reminders, they were constant. Every week, another envelope appeared in my mailbox, stamped with the same official HOA letterhead, carrying the same cold tone: violation, correction, fine. It started with my mailbox color. Non-compliant, must be painted approved, shade 47 within 10 days. 10 days? I had just moved in. I barely had my furniture unpacked, and here I was being told that the shade of my mailbox was apparently a threat to community standards. Then came the hedges. Exceeding maximum height, must be trimmed. Except I had just trimmed them. They weren't overgrown, they weren't even uneven. I measured them twice, they were well within what the guidelines allowed. But that didn't matter. The HOA didn't seem interested in facts, they were interested in control. At first, I paid no mind. A couple of letters, a shrug, a laugh, but ignoring them turned out to be the biggest mistake I could have made. Because once they saw that I wasn't complying, their campaign escalated. One morning, I walked outside to find a bright orange sticker plastered across my front door. Final notice! Final notice? It was the first time I'd even been given a warning in person. The neighbors watched quietly from across the street, their eyes peeking out from behind curtains. Nobody said anything, but I could feel it. I was being marked, singled out. Then came the fines: $50 for the mailbox, $75 for the hedges, another $50 for leaving my trash can too visible, even though it was tucked neatly to the side of the garage. They stacked up faster than I could keep track, and every envelope that arrived carried more threats. If I didn't pay, if I didn't comply, they said they could place a lien on my property. Imagine that, losing your home over a trash can and a mailbox. I tried to reason with them. I attended one of their meetings, walking into the beige community center where they held court. A long table stretched across the front of the room with 5 board members seated like judges at a trial. I barely had a chance to sit down before they started lecturing me. Rules are rules. If we let one homeowner slip, everyone else thinks they can ignore them too. They spoke with the arrogance of people who had forgotten they were neighbors, not rulers. What made it worse was the smugness. They smiled while they told me I was in violation. They smirked while reading off fines. and as I looked around the room I saw my neighbors silent, expressionless, sitting in folding chairs as if they were too afraid to even acknowledge what was happening. But the board wasn't satisfied with fines, they wanted to humiliate me. One weekend I noticed something strange. The grass in my yard was slightly shorter than I remembered leaving it. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then it happened again. Someone had come onto my property and cut the grass without asking, and then unbelievably, I received a letter charging me for mandatory landscaping services. They were fining me for violations and then billing me for the repairs they carried out without permission. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about rules, it was about control. They wanted me to bend to submit to prove that I was just another resident who would stay quiet and obey. I started documenting everything, every letter, every notice, every petty demand. I took photos of the hedges, the mailbox, the trash can placement. I measured my lawn height with a ruler, snapping pictures as proof. I wasn't going to let them twist the truth anymore. But the more I pushed back, the more aggressive they became. Late one evening, I returned home to find a board member standing in my driveway, clipboard in hand, taking photos of my windows. When I asked what they were doing, they didn't even bother to look embarrassed. "Routine inspection," they muttered. Routine inspection, without my consent, without warning. They had crossed from petty fines into harassment. The next week, another letter arrived, this one stating that I was in violation for having unauthorized decorations. The decoration? A small welcome mat at my front door. A welcome mat. They demanded it be removed within 48 hours or I'd face another fine. I felt trapped. Every day I woke up wondering what ridiculous new violation would be waiting for me. Every trip to the mailbox felt like opening a door to another attack. And then came the threat that pushed everything over the edge. Failure to comply may result in legal action, including foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure over a mailbox, over a trash can, over a welcome mat. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by stacks of notices, each one screaming with words like violation and penalty. My dream home, the place I had worked so hard for, was being threatened by a group of neighbors with nothing better to do than flex their power. I thought about paying, I thought about giving in, repainting the mailbox, trimming the hedges, hiding the trash can behind a fence I didn't want. But then I realized something. If I gave in now, it would never end. The board had shown their hand. This wasn't about one mailbox or one hedge. This was about control. And I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. So I started digging. Late at night while the neighborhood slept, I researched the HOA's bylaws, combed through state statutes, and read story after story of other homeowners who had fought back. What I found shocked me. Half of the fines they had issued weren't even enforceable. Their mandatory landscaping service, not authorized by any rule I could find. Their threats of foreclosure, empty bluster meant to scare me. But here's the thing, once you start pushing back against people who are used to absolute control, they don't just sit quietly, they strike harder, and I knew deep down that the battle was only just beginning. Because while I had evidence and determination, they had something else: power. And the lengths they were about to go to keep that power, I wasn't prepared for how ugly it would get. The day it all came crashing together started like any other, a quiet morning, the sound of sprinklers ticking in the distance, birds cutting through the stillness. But the envelope in my mailbox that morning was different. It wasn't another routine fine or laughable violation notice. It was a summons. The HOA had officially filed a lawsuit against me. My hands shook as I read the paper over and over. They weren't bluffing this time. They wanted thousands of dollars in unpaid fines, compensatory damages for their so-called landscaping services, and legal fees on top of it all. And if I didn't comply, they made it clear, foreclosure proceedings would begin. For a moment, I felt paralyzed. The weight of everything I had built, everything I had worked for, balanced on the edge of being ripped away. I could hear the smug voices of the board members in my head, echoing from that meeting I had attended. Rules are rules. But here's what they didn't know. While they had been tightening their grip, I had been preparing. Every photo, every notice, every petty violation, I had cataloged it all. I had binder after binder stacked with proof, timestamps, measurements, official bylaws highlighted in yellow where their rules didn't match what they were enforcing. And I wasn't alone anymore. I had spoken with a local attorney who specialized in HOA abuse, and the moment he saw the stack of evidence, his eyes lit up. "You've got them," he said flatly. "They've overstepped, way overstepped." When the court date arrived, the community center that usually hosted their smug little meetings was transformed into a courtroom of sorts. Folding chairs lined the walls and neighbors filled every seat, buzzing with curiosity. For months, they had watched the board wage war against me. Now they wanted to see the outcome. The HOA board members sat at the front, dressed like they were attending a corporate retreat rather than a neighborhood dispute. Their president, a man who had been the loudest in condemning me, wore a smug smile as if he had already won. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, clutching the binder of evidence so tightly that my knuckles went white. My voice shook at first, but then the adrenaline took over. I laid it all out: the mailbox color, the hedges, the trash can, the welcome mat. I showed the photos, the timestamps, the bylaws. Every single petty notice unraveled in front of the judge like a thread being pulled from a sweater. And then I revealed the most damning piece: the mandatory landscaping services they had charged me for. Nowhere in the bylaws, nowhere in the governing documents, was there any authorization for the board to trespass onto private property and perform, let alone bill for landscaping without consent. It was a blatant violation of state law. The room went silent, the smug smiles faded, even the neighbors who had sat in silence all this time began to murmur. But I wasn't done. I turned the spotlight back onto the board itself, exposing financial irregularities hidden in their budgets. Money that was supposedly collected for maintenance had been redirected into administrative expenses, a category with no receipts, no proof, no accountability. I didn't have to spell it out, the implication hung heavy in the air: corruption. The judge's face tightened as I laid down the final photo, a shot of a board member standing in my driveway late at night, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of my windows. I asked the question everyone was already thinking: what kind of community leadership stalks its own residents at night? The HOA president's composure finally cracked. His face flushed red, his voice rose, and he snapped back at me in a fit of anger. Because you don't respect this community, you think you're above the rules. If we don't control people like you, this neighborhood falls apart. His words echoed through the room, and in that moment he exposed himself for exactly what he was. Not a leader, not a protector of the community, but a petty tyrant desperate to cling to control. The judge raised a hand, silencing the chaos. Then, in a calm but firm voice, he delivered the blow that shifted everything. The evidence is clear. The HOA has acted outside its authority, issued fines without legal standing, and engaged in conduct unbecoming of a governing body. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed. Furthermore, the court will consider sanctions against the HOA for harassment and abuse of power. The board sat frozen. The president slumped back in his chair, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to argue but couldn't form the words. The neighbors began whispering louder now, some even shaking their heads in disbelief. For the first time since I had moved into that house, I felt the weight lift. Months of pressure, intimidation, and fear evaporated in a single instant. I had stood up to them and won. But the moment wasn't just about victory, it was about exposure. The curtain had been pulled back and everyone could see the truth. The board wasn't protecting the neighborhood, they were exploiting it. As the judge adjourned the hearing, I caught sight of the neighbors' faces. Some looked relieved, others ashamed, but all of them looked changed. The silence that had once fueled the board's power had cracked. People were waking up. And as I walked out of that room, past the very people who had once whispered about my violations and avoided eye contact, I could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every resident who had been too afraid to speak, too weary to fight, too isolated to stand alone. The board had been exposed, their grip was loosening. And while the judge's decision had ended their legal attack, it had also ignited something far bigger. Because the battle in that courtroom wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something that would shake the entire community. Walking out of that courtroom, the weight that had been crushing me for months finally lifted. For the first time since moving into that neighborhood, I could take a deep breath without feeling like someone was watching, measuring, or waiting to pounce. The HOA had lost not just legally but publicly. The facade of authority they had built, the iron grip they held over every mailbox, hedge, and trash can, had been shattered in front of the very people they claimed to represent. But while the legal battle was over, the story didn't end there. Because the moment that gavel came down, it didn't just free me, it woke up the entire community. In the days following the trial, the whispers spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had kept silent for years suddenly found their voices. People I had barely spoken to came knocking on my door, quietly thanking me for standing up when no one else dared. Some shared their own stories, fines for wind chimes, warnings for kids' bicycles left near the porch, threats over the wrong kind of holiday lights. It became clear that my battle wasn't unique. The board had built an empire of fear feeding on silence and compliance. Everyone had been living under the same pressure, but nobody wanted to be the first to fight back. Until now. Within a week, a petition started circulating. Neighbors demanded a special meeting to vote on whether the current board should remain in power. The president and his loyal circle tried to resist, calling it disruptive and divisive, but the tide had already turned. The same people who once nodded along in quiet submission now spoke up, and when the meeting was finally called, the room that had once felt like their private courtroom became a stage for accountability. One by one, residents stood up and voiced their grievances. Some shook with anger, others with long-held fear finally breaking free. The list of petty fines, humiliations, and abuses spilled out into the open. Every story echoed mine, small, ridiculous rules used as weapons to intimidate and control. By the time the vote was taken, the outcome was undeniable. The president and his closest allies were removed. A new board was elected, not perfect, not magical, but grounded in the idea that neighbors should work together, not lord over one another. For the first time, it felt like the neighborhood belonged to the people who actually lived there. But the real impact wasn't just in the paperwork or the leadership change, it was in the shift that followed. The atmosphere changed. People who had once hidden behind curtains now waved from their porches. Kids left their bikes in the driveway without fear of their parents being fined. Families decorated their homes for the holidays however they pleased, colorful lights, mismatched inflatables, and all. The streets felt alive in a way they hadn't since I first arrived. And for me, the victory was both personal and symbolic. My mailbox remained exactly the same shade it had always been, a daily reminder that standing your ground mattered. My welcome mat stayed at the front door not because it was rebellious but because it was mine. A simple mat that said home, untouched, unchallenged, finally respected. But even with the victory, I didn't forget the darker side of the fight. I remembered the nights of anxiety, the constant fear of losing everything, the crushing pressure of facing down a machine designed to wear you down. I remembered how close I came to giving in, to paying just to make it stop. And that's why I made a decision to share my story. Because I knew there were countless others out there in neighborhoods across the country living under the same kind of pressure, dealing with the same unfair rules, feeling the same helplessness. If my battle could inspire even one person to stand up, to document, to push back, then it would all be worth it. The lesson wasn't just about beating an HOA, it was about what happens when people stop letting fear dictate their lives, about how silence only feeds abuse and how one voice can spark a chorus. And if you take nothing else from this story, let it be this: bullies, no matter how official they look, no matter how much power they claim to hold, thrive on intimidation. They count on you to stay quiet, to stay small, to believe you're alone. But you're not. I stood alone at first, but in the end, I didn't just win for myself. I won for an entire community that had forgotten its strength. And the ripple effect of that one fight stretched further than I ever imagined. Because sometimes the most powerful change doesn't come from grand gestures or sweeping revolutions. Sometimes it starts with something as small as refusing to repaint a mailbox.